minutes into it. So
All right, let's go ahead and do that then. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kenrick Duru, one of the co-leads of the UCLA RCMAR, and just very excited to have one of our core faculty, Dr. Homero Pino, who will be presenting on responsible conduct of research. And I know he intends this to be very interactive and would like to get people's thoughts and have a discussion. I'll say briefly, he is a philosopher, so he's really, I think, well positioned to speak on this intersection of research and ethics with a master's, I'm sorry, a BA from Cornell and a master's and PhD from UCLA. And he's currently associate professor in psychiatry at Charles Drew and also adjunct associate professor at UCLA and the VA, I think. And he just wanted to note that he's, like I noted, a philosopher who's worked with health departments and CBOs at the national level and has also started a research career that's going very well and interested mainly in the impact of family relationships and health outcomes of sexual minority men of color across the lifespan, substance use, and HIV risk, and is doing a lot of work in that space, and also has a KO1 to explore strategies for engaging the families of Latino SMM and HIV prevention efforts. So I think with that, Dr. Del Pino, please go ahead and start when you're ready.
all right, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today. The topic that I will be covering today is the responsible conduct of research. I would like to invite you to turn on your camera if possible. It just makes it easier to talk to people than to talk into a void. So I would really appreciate it if you could turn on your cameras. So again, just invite you all to turn your camera. And if you have an emoji, that's even better. So what if I told you that reading a PowerPoint aloud isn't the same thing as teaching? It really irks me to when I go to presentations and people just do a PowerPoint and you read from the PowerPoint, because I feel like I can read myself just as quickly. So I don't need anyone to read the slides to me. And also, and more importantly, for your own sake, it'll be very boring if you only hear me talking. So I highly encourage you to ask questions and interrupt me and feel free to just jump in. It'll make this more fun and interesting. So the goal for today's talk is to engage in a conversation about the responsible conduct of research, the responsibility of scientists to society, and ethical reasoning. So kind of sort of three topics that I would like to cover while we're here today. But the goal is, again, a conversation. And the objective, some concrete things you come up away with, is hopefully by the end of this conversation, you can list at least two benefits of conducting research responsibly, and hopefully you can discuss at least one type of ethical theory. So my talk will have three parts. What is the responsible conduct of research? We're gonna look at a case study on social advocacy and data use. I would like to spend a lot of our time here, and then an overview of ethical theories. Any questions so far? All right. Before I get started into the responsible conduct of research, can you all give me a quick show of hands? Has anyone never had any kind of exposure to a course in the responsible conduct of research? I can't see people here.
You can see it on the right here too, if anybody raises their hand.
Okay. So none of you are novices at this, which is great. This is great. So we can just focus more on the case study. So what is a responsible conduct of research? What comes to mind when you hear responsible conduct of research in the first place? Yes.
Of the IRB, other things that come to mind are kind of past events, shape some of the principles and of research that we do now. Yeah.
Like what?
Like I'm gonna forget all of the
Beneficence?
beneficence, non-maleficence, forgetting the justice, things like that. Basically different structures in the way that we do things. Consent, informed consent, and the structure of that. And then those are really sort of the concrete things. Other things that come to mind are how we interact with the community, especially the different types of research that we do. Transparency, things.
Great, the big wide net, awesome. Anyone else want to add something to that when you think of responsible conduct of research?
I can chime in. I think when you're thinking about it, also helicopter research kind of comes into mind. When you have researchers who kind of just dip in and out for the purposes of conducting research, but then maybe don't do the carry through that's required for retaining that kind of trust and engagement of the community. I think that probably plays into it as well.
Definitely. These are all great answers. So where is the responsible conduct of research according to NIH and Office of Research Integrity, etc.? The responsible conduct of research is a practice of scientific investigation with integrity. What a precise definition. Awareness and application of established professional norms and ethical principles in the performance of all activities related to scientific research. So what does all this mean and what does all this cover? And we're going to get into all of that, but what would be the benefits of conducting research responsibly and ethically? One, it'll promote the scientific inquiry. If we can trust that what scientists are doing is objective and valid, then it'll just keep promoting the research enterprise overall. It'll give us public confidence in scientific knowledge, right? And create a research environment that allows scientists to work together. And here we're talking about, and I'll get to this a little bit, issues of exploitation, bullying, right, or harassment in the workplace or the lab or the research environment. So all of these things which may seem marginal to the actual research, right? How I treat my subordinates might seem marginal to how I do my analysis, right? What does that have to do with autistic regression? But the idea with the responsible conduct of research is that it all matters, right? Not about how the results are produced. So what falls under the responsible conduct of research, as you all alluded to? Data acquisition, management, sharing, and ownership. This is especially true when we do research with community partners. Who owns the data? Who owns the research? Do we share this data or not? Or as Dr. Seppian pointed out, do we just do helicopter research? Publication practices and responsible authorship. Some folks, there are problems over who becomes first author or senior author. Like the order of authorships can be an ethical problem, or just adding people onto papers, right, can also be a problem. Mentorship and mentor training, the responsibilities of mentors and mentees and the kind of relationships that we have with one another also falls under the responsible conduct of research. Collaborative research, not just with community partners, but also with other academics. Research misconduct and questionable research practices also falls under responsible conduct of research. Scientific rigor and reproducibility. I think a few years ago, this was the hot button issue at one point, whether all these projects are being funded by the government, can they be reproduced, or can people reproduce these experiments? The protection of human subjects, of course, we don't want to exploit people, take advantage of people. Informed consent is one of the ways in which we ensure that we don't exploit people. The welfare of a laboratory animal. Times have changed from the 50, 60 years ago and how we think about animals and the pain they may experience and how we treat them in labs. So the idea that ethics also extends to them, to other sentient beings, is also something that now falls under the responsible conduct of research. Conflicts of interest and commitment. whether we're getting paid by pharmaceutical industries to do our research. Do we have to disclose if we have any financial conflicts or investments in what the outcomes of our research are? And we mentioned this a little earlier, the safe research environments, harassment, bullying, inappropriate behavior. Scientists as responsible members of society and contemporary ethical issues in science. So where I want to spend my time, our time together, is on this point on scientists as responsible members of society. And one of the reasons why I want to spend my time here is I feel that given the political climate we're going into now, I think our research is even more important. The fact that some research may be cut off, right, may put some of us in a bind as to what to do to ensure that our research continues to be funded, or may put more pressure on us besides the publish and perish pressure to make sure that our projects yield results. So what responsibilities do we have as scientists to society? And this brings us to the second point on the agenda, the case study, social advocacy and data. So I'm going to read out to you the case study, and then I'm going to have some questions around that, and then we'll get into some theories around it. So what obligations, if any, do scientists have to society? Before I put up any answers, what obligations do you think we have to society, if any?
I think we have an obligation to ask questions and conduct research that actually benefits society. And then making sure that the results or what we do with that information is a sort of net benefit over risk. Yeah.
Okay, so we have an obligation to conduct research that benefits society and to make sure that
Ask the important questions, not from just our frame of, mind, but what will actually be beneficial. And then sort of, that cost benefit ratio.
hold that thought.
Okay.
I want to come back to that. No, seriously, hold that thought. We're gonna come back to that. So some obligations that we have are not to harm people. So we think people who conducted the Tuskegee experiment in syphilis definitely harmed people, so failed in their social responsibilities. You might think we have an obligation to help others. If it's at no cost to you, then all else being equal, we should help people when they are in need. And you might think that scientists have an obligation to help society because we're indebted by taxpayers, right? If our research is being funded by tax dollars, then we have an obligation to society. So let's move on to the case study. Keep these in mind, and keep in mind what Dr. Tracy just said. So here's a case study. Helen is a junior faculty member in the School of Public Health. She teaches epidemiology and mentors students in research. Two of her doctoral students conduct a large survey of women's experience of domestic violence. Susan leads the survey and Kate helps with the interviews. Kate herself is a survivor of domestic violence, and her zeal to do this research is rooted in, one, the conviction that society tends to blame the victims. Two, that women tend to underreport domestic violence. And three, that society doesn't really understand the sense of powerlessness, shame, and humiliation that survivors often feel, so they're never going to address the problem effectively. So this is what motivates her. So Professor Helen is pleased when her students ask her to sponsor a panel that they wish to organize at a nationwide professional meeting. However, her pride in her students turns to dismay. Susan, who was leading the surveys, reports findings that are far higher incidence of domestic violence than is reported in the general literature. And Kate gives a dramatic account of the more evocative interviews of women who had given slight indication under survey of some rough treatment at home. Kate concludes with the ringing denouncement of policymakers who downplay the crisis of domestic violence in our society. Some of the experts in the audience start to question the strengths of all these findings. So Helen immediately wants to go over the raw data again with Susan and Kate. And when confronted, Kate says to her, I modified the data because domestic violence is underreported, so I wanted to reflect the way I know it really is. It is important to wake people up to the truth about how domestic abuse forces women to keep their mouths shut. So some questions. What are some of the factors that you think motivate some scientists to become advocates? And how should Helen address this issue with her students? So even before you answer these questions, what are your initial thoughts on this case study?
Well, falsification of data is not a good idea. I think if you're getting to the Helen point, she should be saying that you can express that as an opinion, but not as a result of this study.
Yeah, I'd take that a little further and just say I was horrified around that falsification and, trying to turn results of study into your own opinion.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think as scientists, we have an obligation to be objective and to report objective facts as we find them. To be an advocate is a totally different calling in a sense. And so I think one of the things that you learn in qualitative research as well is to really explore what your role is as a researcher and to be cognizant of what biases you may bring to the research or what personal views you may bring to the research, and to always kind of account for that and to check yourself essentially. And that's something that I would hope could be taught to these young researchers and maybe help them find a more appropriate way of approaching research.
Okay. Dr. Dreese, you were going to say something?
A lot of it was echoing what Helen said. I really just kind of checking your perspective and your, a lot of my lived experience has motivated me to do the type of research that I do. However, what the young researcher did here actually probably weakened everything. And so instead of working as an advocate, it actually weakened the confidence of the data. And so really just the need for a very systematic approach in all research, but especially when you're dealing with qualitative research as well.
Okay, so it could backfire.
Yeah.
And Dr. Norris, I thought I saw you waving your hand.
I think you were saying hi to somebody.
Oh yeah, that was somebody walking by.
Oh, okay. So especially to what Dr. Norris and Dr. Hayes said about falsifying data, what if they were just stretching the truth a little bit, right? When you think of the qualitative, right, the person says, well, I'm just going to play up a little bit more or embellish a little bit what was actually reported. Do you think that still counts as falsification?
I don't know if it does exactly, it depends, but I would say that I'm always skeptical of all data. And qualitative data, there's a lot of room for interpretation. I don't want Gary to get on my back about it, but I'm always thinking really hard about were the conclusions the same that I would reach. And of course, you don't have access to the raw data usually, but just based on what you know.
Okay. So no room for stretching things a little bit. How do you think Helen should address this with her students?
One way would be to clearly separate off the difference between the results section and the discussion. Because the results section are simply what you saw, what you heard. You can't put in new quotes. You can paraphrase, but you got to be true to what people told you. How you interpret the results and what the implications are for others is a separate piece. That's what the discussion is for, right? Because you're doing this usually for a purpose. So you can actually have both. I find it interesting that we tend to think about advocacy as a bad thing, but your discussion, when you say and you have recommendations or you suggest that people should consider, that's a form of advocacy. That's a form of asking other people to do and think like you would like them to, what you think is important. But they're clearly separated between the results section and your discussion. Right. And so we're really clear is we're not, when I'm editing papers, I look and I go, wait a second, you can't put that in your results section because that's your interpretation. That's got to be pulled out and put in the discussion where it belongs, where everybody knows it's now what you think the implications are. So that's how I would try to address it, as you have room, but you have to play these two hats, these two roles, a reporter of just the facts, and then a implication designer of, okay, I'm the expert here, and I think this is how you go. People can question you about your interpretation, but I mean, that's the way I would try to handle this.
So it sounds like what I hear you saying is there's space, there's room for advocacy for sure. It's not a bad word. However, there's like the place for it, not the results section, the discussion section, right? And it will be like a teaching moment for the grad students to perhaps explain to them exactly what you just said, the difference between results, what you saw, and your interpretation or your moment to advocate on behalf of an issue. So along those lines, is there an ethical difference between falsifying data to support a socially important conclusion and suppressing the publication of data that do not support the same conclusion? So hiding data as opposed to making it up, you just don't release it. So omission versus commission, I suppose.
I would say they should be the same, although we tend to think of the adding or modifying of data being worse than omitting data, but it's the same. It's essentially the same problem.
And they're both the same sequel, right?
Yeah, but with one caveat, Keith, that when people, especially in the qualitative realm, when you're exploring, if people don't mention something, right, they don't spontaneously bring it up, and
Right.
you have to report that, or you should report that,
Right.
but we usually don't.
Right.
So how you interpret non-response or people not bringing something up is a really tricky phenomenon.
Yeah,
right.
I was thinking of you've collected the data
Mhm.
and then you've omitted it.
Yeah, you're right. You heard it, but you don't talk about it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And again, I think, maybe I'm not the most ethically upstanding person. I feel like it would be very tempting, especially in this political climate, right? If you have results that say, I don't know, point to giving less support to immigrants, right? Or less support to older adults, right? When you have, I don't know, out of 10 facts, just for the sake of argument, out of 10 facts, you can publish 8 and not those the remaining 2, right? That are not going to advance, I guess, a social agenda, which is different, right? Than the scientific one. And I feel like that's go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is interesting and nuanced, especially as I'm thinking of the logistical process of publication, right? Where you might start out, might have like a narrative piece where you have a word limit or a diagram limit or a table limit. And I know sometimes, most people, like 80% of people basically felt this way, but then there were a few outliers that do you bring this up and then have to dedicate like a paragraph or so trying to explain what that means, or do you leave it out? I know there's some diagrams where I do, there's like been certain like scales or tables where you do like some of the example questions, like which ones do you use, which ones do you don't, which results are you reporting, because you really can't do all of it. And so I'm sure that there's a line somewhere where you're clearly trying to derail what people are saying to skimming. I don't know.
Right, yes. What you made me think of, it can become very easy to hide behind word limits, table limits, figure limits, right? And say, well, of course I couldn't report these last 2 bits of information because there was no room. So Okay, is it ever acceptable to suppress the publication of scientifically valid data for social reasons? Ever?
I think that it's. Ideally, you report everything, right? But then when you look at the stats of which articles and manuscripts are accepted for publication, they're usually positive ones. So I could see a world where if you had multiple projects going on, you might prioritize manuscripts with positive findings first. But yeah, ideally, you're reporting the pertinent positive and negative.
So it sounds like you report everything, you can just prioritize the positive ones first. and then
I do
take
this
over.
for the
Right,
sake
right,
of
right.
conversation.
Yes.
For the
No one
sake
will
of
impugn your moral character.
Please.
Minds have played. Dr. Ryan,
I think partly it depends on who is doing the suppressing. Editors suppress all the time. Their role is to look out for the journal, and the journal is susceptible to all sorts of outside influences and threats. So editors have to make really strategic decisions about what to include and what not to include. That to me is part of their role. All right. But you, as a researcher, when you take on a topic and you decide to whatever, it gets kind of tricky here. I've always assumed that the researcher has the right to scope whatever piece they want to report on. You can't report all your data, so you have to pick out which aspects you want to do and you want to look at. But as soon as you pick out those aspects and you scope the paper, then I think you have to be totally straight up and honest and lay out all the things within that scope. But in some ways, you get to scope it. I mean, we all have more data than you can publish in any one article. All of us have data lying around in file cabinets that has never been analyzed. So you can't do everything. But I think you have an ethical obligation. As soon as you scope it and say, I want to cover this, the first thing you must talk about is the range of things you saw. That's the honest broker. Then you have to lay out, okay, among that, which things were more frequent or less frequent, et cetera. So I get, it becomes really interesting is who is doing the suppressing and what is their role, what is the role they are playing? Because in some ways, some people have roles to suppress or to select what is covered and not covered in a journal.
right, so it's like journals are gatekeepers, basically, right? Like they decide what goes in, what goes, they decide what the public sees, if you will, what the rest of us will see in journals or what we don't see in journals. Why can't we be the gatekeepers? Guess we start our own journals if we want to be our own gatekeepers, I suppose. All right, any other comments on this? We have one more question on this topic. So should scientists ever engage in social activism using their data? Or does science require one to remain objective and engage all sides of a debated issue? Should we ever use our data for activism or advocacy? Or do we have to remain objective and aloof and always look at all sides of an issue?
I think we've already heard that, at least from Gary, that happens. If you have data to support it, there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
As long, I think the one thing I haven't heard too much of is to be also open to other possibilities. So your interpretation is probably going to be affected by what you want to happen, but then to look and say, this seems reasonable, but there's some alternative explanations or implications potentially.
I think as a scientist, you would say, this is my perspective. Here are some other interpretation, like reasonable interpretations as to what, on my findings. But as an advocate or activist, I'm not sure that there will be too much space for reasonable
Well, you don't have to go too far. I mean, it's just at least open up some possibility, and a reviewer may force you to do that anyway. So it's still going to come across as this is your main inference. But I also at the same time recognize someone else might interpret it differently.
And for me, an advocate is someone who is, pushing forwards an issue, but is cognizant or maybe cognizant of the balance of things. Whereas activists, their job is just to get through whatever their issue is, regardless of anything. But that's just my interpretation.
Because I know, Keith, because I always considered them synonyms.
I don't either.
You
Right.
don't?
I
Yeah.
do not. Right.
Okay, yeah. Interesting.
Right. An advocate, an activist, an advocate are two completely different roles in my mind.
So
Tell
the
us more.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more, Dr. Norris?
Yeah, so like a community advocate is someone who's advocating for the health of the community, per se, usually. An activist has one special, an activist is focused on, vaccines, yay or nay, whatever, and they're going to push that at, to the very end. And data has nothing to do with anything regarding their position, other than the data or the information that informed them originally, right? Whatever that was. But now after that, now nothing matters. That's just, they're going to push that agenda. Whereas I think an advocate is trying to be a voice for people who may not have the voice.
So it seems like advocates are more data driven, whereas activists may be more ideology driven, even if there's some modicum of data, but they're primarily ideology driven. That's what it sounds like.
That's how I interpret it. And I think advocates are trying to also, speak up for people who may not feel comfortable speaking up for an issue and things of that nature. But that's just. So when I do community engagement, I'm looking for partners who are advocates, who are health advocates. I don't look for activists.
So are activists synonyms with lobbyists?
Yeah, right. That would be much more, that would be much more aligned to me.
More aligned, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe not getting paid as much.
Right.
I guess
The same agenda, but right, different pay line. Pay scale, I guess.
So this is good, actually. So let me ask you this: what moral principles do you think were at play in the conversations we've had when we talked about, not falsifying data? There's a time and a place of where you advocate versus where you are a reporter, differentiating between activists and advocates. What kind of moral principles do you think were at play? Like, what are guiding ideas, if you will, when we talk about this? Or how to decide which data we publish first or not, right? There's also some deliberative principle at play. What would you all say is at play here? Or in the example?
I think the general principle of truth, but as we know, there's truth can be interpreted in different ways, like, there's my truth versus their truth versus the objective truth, whatever that is. But I think in general, truthfulness of research comes up.
So it's some kind of commitment to objectivity.
Yes.
Broadly speaking. Okay. What else is at play? When we were having these conversations, what sort of principles are we drawing on, or were you drawing on in particular as you thought through this example?
I would say integrity. Just, especially with the data example, right? I'm not wanting to publish certain data or trying to suppress it. But I think integrity comes into play, just publishing it, even if it doesn't fit your narrative.
Okay, so integrity, some kind of commitment to objectivity. Anything else? Okay. So keep those in mind. What is the relationship of science to society? So there are a few views out there, and I just want to focus on what this one person wrote. There is a view of demarcation. The difference between society and science is clearly demarcated. This view of reflexivity, contribution, and integration. And I'm going to review these quickly. And what I would like for you to do as I go through these in a little more detail is think about where do you think you fall? Because I have a sense of where some of you might fall in this, and neither is right or wrong. These are just different views of how people think about the relationship between science and society, right? So demarcation, science should stay separate from society to stay fair. No social influence, right? We have our scientific principles, scientific frameworks, and that's what we stick to. Reflexivity. People who argue that science should be truthful and responsible to society, right? The scientists need to really think about their own role in their research and how this is affecting society. In both these cases, it's still internally driven, if you will. Science is being driven by scientists or for science's sake, if you will. But then we have a view of contribution, that science should focus on innovation and the goals of society, especially in a democratic society. And integration, that scientists and the public should work together on producing outcomes. So when we think of contribution and integration, these views of science, we're not really looking at science for science's sake, whatever that means to most of us, but the idea that science is separate, but we're looking at science in the service of society, right? Or science being done together with people, right? So it's no longer, I'll just leave it at that. Any questions or comments about these different views about the role of science to society?
Well, I think 1 is perhaps dated and 4 is more current. Just they seem to be kind of rarely linked together. I mean, there's certainly a huge shift in involving public and work that's going on right now.
And I'll say, Homero, so number 3, I think it really depends on what the goals of society are, right? So right now, this is a huge debate about, is the goal to have a diverse workforce in minority aging or not? And then I think a lot of the general public falls under 3. They're definitely not thinking about science for the sake of science. And I think that right there is part of the problem that we're having in terms of what's ethical and what's not.
No, I agree 100%. So this is a chart, again, from the same article that I was looking at, where on the, let's see. So here on the left, on the vertical arrow, we have science that's more process focused versus science that's more outcome focused. And along the x-axis, right, we have internal regulation or science for the sake of science versus external regulation. So when we think of contribution and integration, we really think about science being not really driven by scientific endeavor in its own right, if you will, but more in response to what society wants at that moment. So for those who at one point may have had a goal for society to be more diverse and include more voices in research, right? Those goals may now be changing, right? But this views, both views still fall under, you want to argue, might fall under contribution, right? Science is being regulated by society. Scientific goals, scientific endeavors are being regulated by society. And although it is very old school, or, older view, I think as Dr. Hayes pointed out, the demarcation, some folks still see science is very separate, a process focused and more internally driven. Where do you see yourselves on this spectrum, if you will? This really made me think about community engaged research in particular as like integration, right? Where we think of involving people in the science right from the very beginning. So that would be very process focused. Right, and not very outcome focused. We're not trying to produce a certain kind of outcome. We're trying to, sure, there might be a goal overall, right? Like improvement of the health of minority elders, for example, but we think the way to do science in this case would be to involve community members right from the get-go. So that is a sort of involving folks in the very process of science itself. Very different from perhaps the way science was done before, or the way folks think science should be done now. And is there a way to argue which is better than another?
I don't know. I feel like when you were going through them, I was thinking about community engaged research and thinking that was almost a combination of contribution and integration. So yeah, I think it's not necessarily either or in my mind, especially for those two, but a blending or combination of the two.
Okay. Yeah, I think one might argue that community engaged research or results of community engaged research show that involving community members accelerates the discoveries, right, and the benefits to society in the first place, right, or improves the science right from the beginning. But I do want to point out, again, depends on which side, which axis you think is more important. So if you're on the x-axis and you think about science being internally regulated, right, or self-driven versus responsive to external pressures, then community engagement still falls on the external regulation. So like Dr. Andresi, you were saying a combination between contribution and integration, but they both fall on the external regulation, which might be okay. Like I said, it's not clear which is better. And you might say, none of these work, these are all nonsense. Right, but what I know I did hear, and I didn't get a chance to write these down, when I said to you earlier, we'll come back to your point about, making sure, how did you put it? That overall this research benefits society, right? That the net
The question
ratios.
is
Right.
meaningful.
The question is meaningful, that it benefits society. Again, one might say that's external influence on what the scientific endeavor is supposed to be versus science for its own sake.
So, Meryl,
Yes.
it seems like this sort of parallels what we used to sort of the dimension from applied research to theoretical research. And so if you take that as one dimension, then if you ask the question, who gets to decide what the research problem is? Let's assume that all science is based on there's a problem. Either we don't know something or something's happening. There is a problem of which we're going to apply science. So the first question is, who gets to decide what questions are going to be investigated? And then who gets to decide how that investigation occurs? So science, we keep using the word science, but to me, they're really different between what we're studying and how we're studying it. And so I look at this as you go from applied to theoretical as one dimension, not these pieces, and then go from who decides what to do and then who decides how to do it. I think that's where you get a lot of variation, right? So community-based research, you can have the community-based research. Sometimes the decision about what to focus on actually comes from the academic side. Or you could have it where it totally comes completely from the community side, right? And so I think there's a lot of variation here. I'm not sure which one is better.
How would we decide? What would be a good way to go about, let's see, what am I trying to ask here? If we think about training our junior investigators, our new scholars, right? What is the framework we present? Right? How do we present the decision-making around the spectrum, as you pointed out, between, applied and theoretical, right? I think a lot of folks, in my experience, tend to kind of frown upon the theoretical because it has to be practical and have, be useful, quote unquote, versus who gets to decide the question and how it gets done, right? Like these are all very important decisions, right, that we all have to encounter and think about. We may have done so inadvertently or unconsciously, right? We can have our biases and we've done our science the way we've done our science. But if we stop and think about it, what would we recommend to junior scholars or people thinking about entering the field about how they should think about science?
Well, I think a lot of these things, it's sort of both, it may be to different degrees. If you go with what Gary said, what's the question? Well, you certainly don't want, quote, scientists being the only ones who do that. Public has to have input for sure, substantial input. How to do it, maybe that's more science, but still be nice to have input from public. So if you look at histories of community advisory boards, they don't necessarily do a good job of writing questionnaires or whatever, but they can tell you what's important to include in some aspects of the methods.
Yeah, and I think also, just having this conversation just made me think, even this stuff on the slide aside, right? Like, what is the problem? Even that can be highly contested, because you might think one of the problems are, health disparities, health inequities, right? And now you have an administration that says no such thing, right? So even deciding what the problem is, how do we decide or argue or debate like what the problem is, right? People are coming at it with two completely different frameworks and different expectations of what science is supposed to be. It's just a problem I feel that we're going to be encountering more as time unfolds moving forward.
Yeah, one brief point. So, I think this is where PCORI came into being, right? I think there was a feeling that NIH was getting too far from the patients, and now we have the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that, in theory anyway, is supposed to be more aligned with what patients need and want. I guess I've never seen, some point someone is going to kind of look and compare maybe the findings and the efficiency and all that to see which one is, or both hopefully, are just different avenues to do the same thing. But this is not a new question. As you know, this has been a longstanding concern that we're not patient focused enough at the NIH. And so I think it's still to be written exactly to your point. Where do we settle, or where should we settle on this?
Yeah. But I also think that this conversation, as we talk, we keep talking about us and people. And sometimes I think what we're talking about is individual investigators making choices, but sometimes we're talking about human beings in positions of authority that determine what is to be funded and so forth. As you move up that scale, you start there's still investigators that are making these choices, but they're wearing different hats. They're playing different roles at this higher level of what is to be funded. How do you decide where the money is coming, what money is put out there, what the RFAs are, and then within the RFAs, who's getting funded and whatnot. Those to me are different types of decisions than you as a personal and as an individual investigator deciding where do I want to fit in this giant world of potential research questions.
Yes.
And I don't know what to do with it, but I do think that there's a really big distinction between that, right?
Yeah. And I think it's something worth coming back to and teasing out as we continue to go through this new era we're now in.
Let me
So-
just, Jennifer put an important note in the chat, and I just wanted to hit on, because we talked about this at RCMAR recently, about PCORI and how it's funded. So yeah, for everyone to know that it's funded by a 1% tax on the health plans in this country, and the funding is not coming from the NIH. So at least theoretically, the PCORI funding should be less affected by congressional decisions because it's coming from the health plans. We'll see how
Unless
this
they-
plays out. Yeah, we'll see. But I
Unless-
think, go ahead. Sorry, Gary.
Go ahead. Keep
No,
going.
no, I was just gonna say to Jennifer, I mean, I think, we're all working as hard as we can, but that's something you can file away in your thinking in terms of what the future might hold. But at this point, none of us truly have the answers that we'd like.
I was just
Yeah,
gonna say. Go ahead, Jennifer.
I was saying, yeah, I looked that up, but then I was confused about, is a tax on the health plan, so like being a tax isn't affected. As you can imagine, our junior investigator brains are doing circles a little bit, but yeah, we'll follow closely.
All right, so I'm going to skip through this so I can get to a quick overview of ethical theory since we have about 5 minutes. And what I would like to leave you with is what is ethics in research to begin with, right? So I like this quotation. There's a notable lack of clarity about what actually constitutes ethical issues or how they are understood by the various stakeholders involved. Right? People say ethical issue, ethical dilemma, ethical conflict, ethical controversy. Like, what is all this? And what I want to point out are 2 sets of theories or categories of theories, really. Consequentialism, this idea that actions are morally assessed solely by the states of affairs they bring out, right? We're not talking about whether actions are good or bad, we're just talking about consequences. So sacrificing one person for the many works out, then that's what we do. Because we're not worried about how we treat an individual or any individual, we're just worried about what consequences come about. As opposed to like the ontological theories or duty-based theories, right? The actions are morally assessed by rules and principles, right? We're looking at what the person's intentions are and the actions to actually commit. The 10 Commandments are examples of that, or this view that you cannot use people to produce good consequences. Right, so, and to throw something else in the mix is also this idea of rights, right? Everyone talks about rights this, rights that, but what exactly is a right? Right? One view of rights is that it's a justified claim, entitlement or assertion of what a rights holder is due, right? They have the right not to be harmed, right? Again, these are normative rules about what is allowed of people or owed to people, right? The right not to be killed. But rights can be legal rights, like the right to vote, and they still debate this. They can be natural rights. There's people who think that you're born with certain God-given rights, or you're just born with certain rights in virtue of being a human being, right? Of how you should be treated. But it never hurts to ask, like, where do these rights come from in the first place? All right, for people who are more legally minded, if it's not a legal right or a political right, then it's not a right at all. It has to be given to you by someone or some institution. And that, of course, not that a natural right might be. And I know people talk about having a right to health or a right to healthcare. But what exactly does that mean? And where does that right come from? Being US centric right now, like, is it in the Constitution? Is this a political right that's been given? Like, where does this come from? If it's there at all. So, when we think about the case, when we think about conducting science that will benefit society, we're being consequentialists a bit, right? When we think about you have to have integrity, right? We're being more deontological, right? When we think we shouldn't mistreat people or abuse people, right? We're granting them certain rights. So it's almost like a hodgepodge of views that we bring to the table. So again, it's thinking about the case study. Do you have a better sense of what the right answer is about how to approach what these grad students are doing in terms of advocacy and data fudging, manipulating, or fabricating? Right? And I like to think that the answer is maybe. It's never so clear. But just because it's not clear doesn't mean there is no real answer, right? Again, what principles did we come up with? We thought about community-based principles, we thought about integrity. And I just kind of jumped the gun for you and said, how would you categorize the reasoning we engaged in? And I think if we go back and look at this recording and hear what we all said, we would see a mixture of consequentialist thinking and deontological thinking, right? So there's a problem with moral guidelines as well, right? There is no unified moral theory, no unified moral framework for addressing controversies in science. A lot of it has been an ad hoc combination of moral principles, right? Like even when you think of the IRB trainings you do, right? Like principles of beneficence, like why? Says who? Where does that come from, right? And there's appeals to rights. So all of this, right, I think doesn't help how we really approach or think about the responsible conduct of research or the problems that can arise when we conduct research. So again, the implications. How do we approach the responsible conduct of our own research? And how do we think about ethics in our own research? Like, have we really stopped to think about ethics besides don't do what's wrong, do what's good, benefit people, right? How do we deepen our understanding of what our ethical obligations may be when we conduct research, especially now given the political climate? So I said when we started this presentation that our objectives was to list at least 2 benefits of conducting research responsibly, and also discuss 1 type of ethical theory, which we just reviewed. So that is all I have for you today. Any questions, comments, or final?
Thank you so much. That was terrific and very thought-provoking, I think, for all of us. I'm seeing thumbs up and nodding heads and clapping, so you're getting all kinds of good responses. And I agree, something to think about, for sure, for all of us. So I know, Christina,